shall begin. All right, everybody. Well, welcome to the 7th symposium, UMD Symposium on Environmental Justice and Health Disparities. My name is Joseph Galarraga. I am a faculty assistant with the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice and Health at the University of Maryland School of Public Health, and I'm going to be moderating this session. So we have a number of questions. At the end, hopefully we'll have some time for a Q&A. So I'm very happy to be here with you all. And I think maybe we can start with a round of introductions. So all of our attendees can have some familiarity with you, your work with homeless populations and unhoused people. And let's begin. So let's start with you, Dr. Savage, and tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and how you came to join us today.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be with you all again this year, and good to see you all this afternoon. I'm Joe Savage. I am a regional coordinator with the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, or USICH. We are the federal government's policy making body as it relates to homelessness. So we set federal policy around homelessness, and I'm one of 5 regional coordinators. My region covers the mid-Atlantic and southeastern states, everything from Pennsylvania down to Florida over to Kentucky and Tennessee. And essentially, as a regional coordinator, we assist communities, whether it's at the state or the local level, as well as providers in understanding federal policy and how to implement policy at the local level into practice. And my area of expertise is in homelessness, affordable housing, community, and economic development.
Thank you very much. Next, let's hear from Marcia Hale.
Hi, everyone. It's really good to be here with you all today, and especially with this illustrious panel. I'm Marcia Hale, and I'm coming to you from North Carolina, Greensboro, where I moved in 2018. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies. And I came here after 12 years in Los Angeles, where I did many things, including working on a citywide environmental justice policy with a group of community-based orgs, as well as completing both an MA and a PhD in urban planning. And so I entered those programs wanting to understand more about transboundary resource conflicts, especially water conflicts, and wound up conducting research really on urban water systems and thinking about how they're transitioning, how they're changing, and looking at those changes through an environmental justice lens for opportunities. I also wound up participating in a long-term project around the homeless courts of Los Angeles County. And so in that capacity, I collected tons of stories as interview data. And I continue to use those stories as lenses to understand my research and advocacy through, which is at the intersections of global environmental change, justice, conflict, disaster, and migration, and trying to understand, what humane systems could look like that can support the weight of those realities. And in part, I do that through some participation in a new network called the Global Climate Homelessness Network that's organized by Sean Kidd and researchers at the University of Toronto. So it's great to be here with you all today.
Thank you so much, Marcia. And let's hear from Senator Washington.
Great. Good evening. Good afternoon, everyone. So happy to be here. First of all, I want to thank the University of Maryland for this symposium, and especially for making these connections between environmental justice and public health. This is really important work that needs to be done to reduce disparities as a function of race, sexuality, class, immigrant status compared to the majority and the wealthy. I'm State Senator Mary Washington. I represent the 43rd Legislative District. I'm one of 6 senators who represent Baltimore City and Annapolis. There are 47 senators across the state of Maryland. My professional and personal connection to this issue and these issues are multiple and longstanding. First of all, I have a PhD in a related public health field, sociology and population statistics that I earned from the Johns Hopkins University. Prior to serving in Annapolis, I created and managed environmental and education workforce development programs at the Parks and People Foundation. I currently serve on the Education, Health, and the Environmental Affairs Committee. And we've recently passed legislation to create a Maryland Commission on Health Equity, and I'm honored to be assigned to serve on that commission. I am the chair of the Senate chair of the Joint Committee to End Homelessness in Maryland, which was the result of legislation that the creation of this Joint Committee was the result of legislation that I passed in 2014 along a series of reforms and legislation, mostly focused on unaccompanied homeless youth, but certainly encompassing all of those who are unhoused. I'm also a member of the part-time faculty of the Maryland Institute College of Art. So I always accept opportunities to speak with my colleagues in the academy and those who are studying these topic areas. I teach poverty and homelessness. I teach sociology and some mathematics classes. On a personal level, I'm an out Black woman, and I see the impacts on my family and friends and neighbors. I've been educated, particularly by youth homelessness advocates, about the importance of these issues, and it's why I'll always do this work. And so honored to be here and look forward to a productive and stimulating conversation.
Thank you so much. Can we hear from Eric Bonds now?
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited to learn from the panelists up here. My name is Eric Bonds, and I'm an associate professor of sociology at the University of Mary Washington. And I think what brought me here is that I do research. I've done research in my local community on homelessness using an environmental justice lens, making the argument that certainly it is an environmental justice issue when poor people are overburdened with pollution, but when communities, adopt laws, that civility codes that effectively criminalize homelessness, that when there are NIMBY movements and anti-homelessness sort of sentiment from a local group of community members that work to prevent the establishment of organizations that do homelessness services, that effectively ends up treating visibly poor people and unhoused people as a kind of pollution, pushing them from the community into the less visible edges. So I'll leave it there, but I'm really excited to hear what everybody has to say.
Thank you so much. Appreciate all of the introductions from everybody. So I do want to begin with discussing, this is the UMD Symposium on Environmental Justice and Health Disparities. And I think it's necessary to discuss how homelessness perpetuates environmental health disparities. So from your experiences, your work, what sorts of health hazards are the unhoused exposed to, and how are they exposed disproportionately, perhaps, than other populations? So let's start actually with you, Eric, if you wouldn't mind.
Absolutely. Housing is a human right because, the exposure to the elements, it, produces negative health outcomes, right? They're just thinking about, right now, the heat, humidity, cold, storms. So, that's obviously a health disparity, but also, just the insecurity of not having, a secure housing itself produces toxic stress that weighs on a body, that has impacts on a body and negative health outcomes. And that could be just not knowing where one's going to sleep, in a permanent basis. But if one's out on the streets, just the stress that comes from, maybe just the negative looks that one might receive from members of the public, but also just the fear of losing one's possession, being caught up in a sweep or something like that. It's that stress weighs on people and definitely produces negative health outcomes.
Thank you so much. Does anybody else want to follow up with that question? Anybody have anything to add here? I'd like to hear from anybody who has some thoughts.
Well, okay, we all have thoughts absolutely over here on that. The extreme weather that was mentioned food insecurity. There's also, of course, vulnerability to being the survivor of violent and sexual crimes. You spoke a little bit about the criminalization of the unhoused and of homelessness, but there's also the realities that individuals are exposed to crimes and violent crimes in ways that is disproportionate impact on them, particularly recently when it comes to COVID. The unhoused populations who seek temporary housing and shelters are at great vulnerability still to being infected. And we know they have a lack of access to healthcare, so that means they're a greater risk of death due to COVID. And most importantly, I would say the greatest challenge or risk is that there's not a very clear articulated plan to vaccinate unhoused people. And while at the same time, I do want to lift up the work of the partnership that Baltimore City has with the University of Maryland health systems through housing individuals at the Lord Baltimore. And that is a really good model that I think should be spread throughout Baltimore, but also throughout the state. But again, these vulnerabilities were not created, of course, by COVID, but I think that the COVID pandemic has really highlighted and made more drastic the vulnerabilities and the existing environmental health disparities that we see.
And an additional thing that I'll add, Eric did an excellent job of highlighting some of the major health disparities that exist amongst those who are living unsheltered. And one of the most significant things that perpetuates these health disparities is the lack of stable and affordable housing. The research has shown us that when someone is stably housed, they are more likely to follow up with their healthcare appointments and they improve their health status. And the reason why it's important to understand that is because the common perception is that if someone is homeless and they're dealing with health issues, whether it's mental health or substance use, they need to get their health issue under control first. And then once they get that under control, they then can go into housing and they'll remain stably housed. Well, the opposite is actually what works. Get people into stable housing first, and then give them the necessary services and access to healthcare so that they can then address their healthcare issues. Because when someone is stably housed, they are more likely to follow up with their medical appointments. So being unhoused really perpetuates these health disparities. And it's not that they need to get the health issue under control first before they deserve housing. They get into the housing first, provide them with the services, and then we'll see improvement in their health status.
Thank you so much. I think that's a very, very important point. I also wanted to take a moment to introduce Lisa Fay, who's joined us here, who is one of our co-panelists. So maybe if you want to give a brief introduction, Lisa, that would be very much appreciated. All right, perhaps Lisa's still having some technical difficulties, unfortunately. Marcia, would you like to follow up with the question?
Sure. The only thing that I would add to those very comprehensive responses is that, you know, the nature of the experience of homelessness varies widely. So just looking at homelessness here in the US, there are, of course, folks who have been priced out of housing, people that have gone through incredibly, you know, traumatic lives that have found themselves without housing. But then through climate change and political violence worldwide, there are a lot of folks that are living here without housing that are migrants from other places. And so the connection to, you know, pre-existing health conditions, especially, you know, in my realm, those connected to water. I'm just thinking right now specifically about kidney disease and the increasing rates of kidney disease around the world that are connected to heat stress and dehydration. And then folks that are living here without access to stable housing and therefore stable sources of water, those conditions just get exacerbated. I interviewed a man in Los Angeles who had been hospitalized 3 times in the previous year for dehydration. And that was in 2015. So with temperature rise and increasing aridity, these health conditions are only going to worsen. And just to shine a light for a moment on, the trauma lens, which so many of the other folks on the panel had pointed to, that there is, certainly the existence of physical health issues connected to the experience of homelessness, but then also just how traumatic the experience itself is. And especially for folks who already are coming from traumatized experiences, the complex trauma that's created can make it really difficult to change situations.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. I think that all bringing up many different dimensions of the types of hazards that are experienced, but I think it is very important to notice it's not this is not necessarily a monolithic community, and there is a lot of that variety that we see in what homelessness might look like for people. So thank you for that point. I also want to note that this is part of, at this year at the symposium, we have a number of sessions that are sort of under this intersectional sort of panel. And I think that homelessness doesn't only intersect with environmental justice, but it's often intersecting with some other topics that we're discussing at this year's symposium. For instance, I don't think it's possible to talk about homelessness without mentioning the affordable housing crisis that's being experienced across the United States. So how can housing advocates and planners, community developers, government officials, et cetera, support unhoused populations, and what sort of policy solutions have you seen implemented elsewhere that might help homeless people in the region, the DMV? And so let's start this one with Dr. Savage, if you want to start.
Sure. And what I'll do is I'll focus on some of the policy solutions that I've seen. When we talk about the development of affordable housing, one of the biggest issues is the cost to construct the housing. And we know that there are a number of regulatory barriers that increase the cost of affordable housing, down from the planning process to approving permits to zoning, et cetera. So where we've seen communities that have been successful in lowering the cost of the development of housing is where they've streamlined their internal planning process, where they've streamlined their permitting process, and all of those type of regulatory changes, even down to zoning, allowing for multifamily housing zoning, that decreases the cost of housing, and it makes the development of a housing more attractive to housing developers. So that's one of the big policy changes that we've seen at the local level. And then also a big deal with affordable housing. If we're not talking about the construction of new housing, then we're talking about rental housing. That's the quickest, that's the easiest to access. However, there are huge issues with recruiting landlords who are willing to rent to a homeless household on a subsidy in comparison to renting on the private market, someone who can pay the full $1,500 versus someone with a voucher where the landlord is only going to get $900. We've really seen communities at the local level, particularly mayors, who really jump forward and really launch public messaging campaigns about renting to homeless households, recruiting landlords, combating NIMBYism, and then also the development of what we call risk mitigation funds at the local level. And essentially, these are local dollars that go towards landlords in the event that, let's say, the unit is damaged beyond the cost that the federal government would reimburse the landlord for, as well as providing incentives and bonuses to landlords who are willing to rent to homeless households. So at the local level, as it relates to policy, we see changes relating to regulatory barriers, as well as policies that encourage landlords to rent to homeless households.
Thank you so much. Lisa, I see that you're able to join us now. I would like for you to give a quick introduction, and then I'm curious about any thoughts that you have on how various advocates and officials, planners, developers can support unhoused populations through policy that you've seen.
Lisa Fay. I am the chairperson for an organization out of Portland, Oregon called Right to Survive. For many years in Oregon and California and Colorado, we've been trying to pass the right to rest. and take it from a bill and turn it into a law, which would give basic protections under the law for houseless individuals. And part of those protections would be the ability to obtain housing. As a broader picture, I do a lot of work with education and advocacy for the houseless population. If they know their rights and they know the barriers that they're facing, then they can advocate for themselves. They can learn to change laws, change ordinances, change the system so that once you become houseless, everything's not lost to you. You can still turn the key. You can make adjustments locally, and hopefully it catch on and be something that works, be national.
All right, thank you so much. Do you want to talk more about the policy, the right to rest policy? We're talking about policy solutions at the moment, and that piques my interest.
Yes, it has 5 main components, and it's the right to rest in public space, the right to I'm blanking. The right to rest in public space, the right to housing, the right to have reasonable accommodations made, and there's one other that the right to rest gives you.
Right.
Basically, we're asking for the same basic rights as everybody else has when being whenever you're up against discrimination.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Eric, you want to jump in here?
Absolutely. I just would completely agree with those other points. And maybe just in general, just efforts to repeal civility codes that are on city books. Almost every community around the city has these laws that sort of prevent a right to rest for everybody. These laws that just even some cities that prevent food sharing, prevent sleeping in cars, etc. I've been I've been in my own research just very critical of how my own community has handled homelessness and its criminalization of homelessness, but something that I did not expect to see just actually a few days ago, the city manager is talking about allocating several $1 million of COVID relief funds towards housing in a housing first sort of model that would be combined with some additional funding in the region. And that was very, very hopeful thing. And I think that it's going to be a big community fight, but I think when, if communities can prioritize this issue right now, potentially, at least in some places, there is some available money.
Excellent, thank you. Senator Washington?
Absolutely, yes. This is really important. And of course, the question is so long to address everything, and so I'm glad Caretaker Vey, and my other colleagues have hit the main points of absolutely the lack of affordable housing. We really found that in our Joint Committee on Ending Homelessness, which I said was created in statute, and one of our first year of the committee. That's what we came up with consistently been listening to the advocates and doing the research and having the hearings, particularly in a state like Maryland. So I appreciate the global view, but particularly in a state like Maryland with extremely high housing costs, individuals lacking affordable housing. So housing instability in conjunction with being unhoused is absolutely an economic issue. And I fully agree and endorse that developers need to have incentives to provide affordable housing. We also need to hold these landlords accountable to have quality affordable housing, because there's a lot of issues around ensuring that not only that the housing is affordable, but that it's safe. And advocates, the advocate community, both allies and persons experiencing homelessness, need to hold both entities accountable. And something that wasn't said is that states and our nation needs to spend more money in housing, and we need to build this housing and provide that. I want to say a little bit, if I may, about the housing first. That it is indeed while I fully support what Dr. Savage and others who've said about, look, it's important to get individuals into house. And a lot of the prior programs that required one to be sober and required all of these conditions prior to getting a housing voucher or prior to being in a shelter, put them at risk. But I would also say that this complete move to housing first does also provide a risk for unhoused people when forcing individuals into shelters without the type of wraparound support services that they need for mental health or addiction or counseling or workforce development and legal services. So what I would like to see us do is to sort of not necessarily dial it back, but don't just incentivize the housing first model and take away from providers that are providing wraparound services, because that's actually how HUD, and I'm glad there's a regional director here from that, HUD is incentivizing housing first, and then taking away from individuals that seek for their own recovery, seek to be in a household where that's not, where there's not where they can avoid people and places and things as a part of their program, where they can get housing support, counseling services with the individuals that they've built relationships with. So I think that we could do both. And I believe that would be the next challenge.
Great. Yes, a need for a holistic approach is what I'm hearing. Thank you so much. And Marcia, any thoughts here?
Sure, just to piggyback a bit off of Senator Washington, I'm really interested in doing research on how different agencies can become more trauma informed. And so especially coming from an urban planning background, where mental health training really isn't a part of those curriculums, and trauma, my experience and understanding of it is that it can be completely, well, first of all, it's cyclical. So it's really easy to re-traumatize, to be re-traumatized and to re-traumatize folks. And so, thinking about wraparound programs and all of the different agencies that are involved in addressing this issue, it's interesting to think about how more training could be brought to bear on those departments and agencies. So that folks can be more aware of, the deep issues with trust, for instance, that can come along with trauma. That could then keep people from really connecting to the services that could help them. And then I guess the only other point is that in addition to, addressing how homelessness is criminalized, also thinking about the criminal justice system as a whole, and the structural racism and direct racism that are embedded within that system, as well as just other forms of violence and structural violence that keep people within the system, whether it's incarcerated or, probation or parole. And we know that those states are really deeply connected to, the attainment of jobs, the attainment of housing. And so, addressing those issues, which I'm not smart enough in this moment to do, but I just wanted to, bring them into the conversation as severe barriers to finding, secure housing and secure jobs.
Thank you so much.
And Joseph, if I could just respond to a comment that's in the chat box. Understand, when we talk about housing first and we talk about true fidelity to housing first, we're not just talking about getting individuals into housing, but we're talking about the housing plus the services. And when it comes to housing first, understand that even though we're emphasizing putting people immediately into stable housing, it is the client's choice. It is the individual's choice. So if they don't want to go into housing, they want to choose some other type of option. Let's say they want to go into long-term treatment, etc. That is totally their option. Housing First isn't forced upon anyone, but the underlying philosophy about Housing First is that people don't have to become stable first in order to deserve or to earn the right to housing. No, people have a right to housing. And if they want to go directly from the street and into housing, they can do that with the services so that they can remain stably housed, but it's not forced upon anyone. It is totally the client's choice.
Thanks for the clarification. Appreciate that.
Could I sort of just talk about how that works on the ground? And again, this is a perspective that I get coming from sort of an academic policy, and then actually how states implement and how it happens. So the way it happens, unfortunately, Dr. Savage and everyone, is that there's an application process, and you get funding, and there's a scoring system, right? And so right now, the way it's set up is that those organizations that are Housing First, those organizations that also have supportive services get less points because of the balance. So essentially these organizations that have provided the wraparound services that attend to the trauma, that attend to workforce development, that provide sober communities for those who want them, are being defunded. And so they have to choose to either get rid of a core part of their mission, which in one case in my district, which is to provide sober living for women who choose it, to now try to figure out how to switch their mission and provide less of those services. Now, fortunately, this organization has been able to raise money to supplement the $250,000 drop in funding that they got because they decided to maintain, their commitment to providing that. But then there are other organizations that simply are not able to provide it at the level. So there's the philosophy of Housing First, which I wholly support. But I think that the way we implement it and the way we fund it and the scoring system has to be changed. Otherwise, the kind of cyclical trauma and cyclical in and out of housing and unhoused is going to maintain.
And you're absolutely correct, Senator Washington. And, in just to provide more clarification around that funding, when we talk about funding that's coming out of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, when they release those funding NOFAs, they do have criteria that scores projects or programs that implement Housing First higher. Understand one thing about HUD is that HUD is a housing agency, and over the past couple of decades, HUD has been switching from funding services to focusing solely on funding housing. So that's why we see a lot of the change with a lot of services, supportive services only organizations having their funding reduced through the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And what we're trying to do at the federal level is, okay, so if HUD is going to focus on funding the housing component, then we're really pushing and moving Congress to get the Department of Health and Human Services to really improve and increase the funding that they provide on the services. And that's why we see that huge shift when it comes to funding that particularly comes out of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the emphasis on Housing First and housing, and then moving away from funding just supportive services.
And then just remember, in the meantime, while we try to get a Congress that has not been able to pass anything for several years, real people are losing services, and real people are going unhoused and are not being provided with the resources that we need. So I do think we have to figure it out, and that we want to advocate on the state of Maryland to figure out how to subsidize that and to support that. But states need support, and I'm hoping the new administration and new point of view that we can recognize the reality versus what the theory is. And housing cannot be disconnected from people's lives and their experience of that housing. And so I do understand the shift, but I just think it's in the wrong direction. So.
Okay.
Thank you, though. Thank you so much. I just wanted to, I felt like that's something that needed to be said.
Well, yeah, I appreciate the clarification, and it's obviously a multi-departmental issue that we see here. Once again, kind of demonstrating to me a need for maybe an approach that's more holistic, less segmented and things like that. But I do want to move us along a little bit. And I do want to talk about, we're talking about this intersectionality. One of the questions that I have is that, Marcia, your research has taken an international approach to assessing homeless populations' access to public water. And I think that this is something that's really important too, when we're talking about we're talking about people having access when they are unhoused to public services. What are the implications of that? What are the implications of homeless populations being unable to access public services? So.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I'll just focus this brief response specifically on the water system because that's the system I'm most familiar with. And, this insight came from looking at urban fabric across several metropolitan cities, again, in the transnational context, and realizing that, our modern water systems have been designed for buildings rather than for people. So cities around the world report 100% water access, improved water access, but that access is for buildings rather than for humans. And so there are a lot of humans moving through urban and other spaces that are not connected to a permanent building and therefore lack access to water. And then when we think about city parks, and especially here in the United States, Julian Agyeman and others in the just sustainabilities and environmental justice movements have noted how public parks have become increasingly privatized, and that's through mechanisms such as, very early closing hours. So people, can't go into the park to get water after a certain time of night. And then we also see a lot of like dog park and kid park structures within city parks. And often whatever water fountains are available are within the kiddie park area or the dog park area. And that can be, challenging for people just, moving through to access. So, back in the days of ancient Greece, Pausanias was a Greek philosopher who said, a city is not a city without fountains. And there are still cities around the world where you see readily available public water fountains, such as in, Istanbul. And, if people have seen photos of places in the Middle East, it was an arid climate. So water fountains were very much a part of the public structure. And they were fountains that filled vessels. So they weren't just, the single use fountain. And we're seeing, I think, more and more of those in airports. If folks have traveled through airports recently, you can bring your water bottle and fill it up. But it seems increasingly important to make sure that there are water sources available, especially within our cities, because so often, folks who are either, migrating transnationally or even regionally do wind up spending significant time in urban space, while they're figuring out housing. And so having sources of water available is really key. And just the other thing to add, to think about, when you move through a city, where you would go to get water, if it's not in a park or at a public fountain, you would go into a public restroom, or maybe you would go into, a restaurant. But increasingly, there are less public restrooms available, and those bathrooms are available in shops or in restaurants. And, you have to have funds often to be able to, spend in the business in order to be able to access the bathrooms and the water. So, that's my little pitch for public water. And again, thinking about climate change and increasing temperatures and the connection between increasing temperatures, dehydration, and public health. It's an issue that's just growing in importance.
Great,
and
thank
9/11 and 9/11 had a huge impact on accessing, public facilities and even water fountains for individuals who were homeless. Prior to 9/11, you could walk into pretty much any public building, a city building, and get to a water fountain, use a public restroom, and have access to water. Once 9/11 happened, you see a lot of security measures now in these public buildings where, in order to even get to the water fountain or to get to the bathroom, you either have to have an ID or you have to have an appointment with an agency within that building. And so 9/11 had a huge impact on access to water through public facilities.
Thank you for that point. I think that's something that, I also am hearing in this and talking about heat and climate change, it's a nice sort of segue to our next question. I think about, and particularly in urban centers, that you see huge disparities in urban heat depending on neighborhood, amenities, disamenities, things like that. And I think that that goes sort of hand in hand with that a lot of times you see, areas that have been completely disinvested in, and certainly no access to water in areas like that, but areas where you might have a little bit more access to water are maybe at the city centers that are, the economic centers as well, where homeless people are, that we talk about this criminalization of, unable to rest in public and things like that. But sort of to segue, talking about urban heat and homeless communities in Baltimore, that back in November of last year, advocates and government officials rallied against plans to raise a homeless encampment under I-83 in Baltimore, citing that a dispersion of this community could cause further spread of COVID-19 and would violate CDC guidelines. And to me, this raises a lot of questions. How has COVID-19 affected homeless communities? I know Senator Washington, you touched on this a bit. But what resources are available to those experiencing homelessness who have been exposed to COVID-19? And I think the biggest question to me that this raises is, and why does it take a pandemic to protect the communities that homeless populations establish via encampments? Like, these are communities that we would raise if it weren't for the fact that perhaps their dispersion might spread more COVID across perhaps the house communities. That's sort of what I hear from this. So I wanted to start with you, Senator Washington. We'll go through, everybody can have a chance to comment on this. I'm kind of obviously leading this discussion with my own biases here, but I'm curious to hear what you all think.
Well, again, that's the discretion of the moderator. That's one of the pros of being the moderator, is to shape the conversation. But I think we all are enjoying the direction. The honest answer is that, while I don't want to underplay the true humanity and desire to help all those in need that COVID-19 raised up in us, and that there are individuals in all of our communities who are working every day to support those who are unhoused, who are committed to ending racial disparities and structural racism wherever it exists. The broader political public, I believe it was more about the stigma associated already with the unhoused as being, more likely to spread the COVID-19 to, as you said, to the housed population. We see this, as you said, with the moving of the encampments and the pushing away of persons who are experiencing homelessness or who are living outdoors, away from commercial shopping areas, away from the public venues, that Dr. Hale has mentioned, that it is, again, that's why we do as a society what we always do. There has to be an emergency before that there's a reaction. But I think we will take it and see what we can do to support.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that response. I'd like to go to Lisa, if we could.
Yes, here in Portland, we've done a number of things. We've used our federal dollars for hotel vouchers to put houseless people in hotels. We opened up our convention center and provided aid. Many organizations such as Right to Survive band together and have done street outreach, making sure people have all the information they need to stay safe, making sure they have the materials they need, creating hand wash stations that basically are a Rubbermaid style trash can with a faucet attached, and keeping sanitizer and soap and refilling the jugs every day, every week, whatever's necessary. Basic hygiene, we set up a hygiene station, and others have set up hygiene stations around the metro area. Keeping people safe with information, people bringing food to them so people can have safe distancing, understanding vaccines, getting the word out about vaccination. A lot of it, I understand the restraints of government on each level, and that's why there's organizers and advocates out here on the ground getting the resources to people.
Thank you. I appreciate that perspective. I want to hear what Eric, you have to say going forward.
Sure. Maybe I'll just briefly add this. This horrible pandemic. It did upend things, and it did just create more attention on certain things that maybe many members of the public weren't paying attention to. And this awareness, this thing that we all hear saying is that we're not going to go back to normal because maybe it wasn't so good to begin with. So I mean, it does create some opportunities, but opportunities that we have to fight for.
Certainly. Anybody else want to jump in on this question here?
Sure. In terms of, why it took a pandemic, I think, Senator Washington said something that is so important because it was an emergency. And the thing that we have to understand is that typically when marginalized and disenfranchised groups are experiencing a social issue, it's not brought to anyone's attention. No one really cares about it. But when there's an emergency that impacts the majority and those who are in power, because of structural racism and the policies that we have in place, things don't come to the majority's attention and really get action until it's an emergency or a crisis that impacts the majority and those in power. And it shouldn't be that way. And so what we're seeing with this pandemic is the same thing that we saw with the Great Depression. Prior to the Great Depression, if you were in poverty, that was your fault. There was some type of moral flaw. Then the stock market crashes. And now we realize, anyone as a result of social and economic circumstances can become impoverished. And now we're seeing the same thing with the pandemic, and our society should not be built that way. And so here we have this pandemic, and now all of a sudden we're realizing these issues with addressing encampments and clearing those types of issues. And it just really should not be that way.
All right, thank you. I want to make sure that we have time for the Q&A, so I'm going to maybe move on to our last question. And as I said before, this is the UMD Symposium on Environmental Justice and Health Disparities. But I think that homelessness is an issue that in our society is a bitter pill to swallow. We've talked about the stigma that homeless populations, unhoused populations experience. And unfortunately, I think that this is something that's often mirrored in the environmental justice movement. I think that the literature on EJ and homelessness is pretty scant. It's pretty sparse. And I think that that's great to have you all here talking about it today. So hopefully we can sort of change these things. But how can the environmental justice movement, be more inclusive of unhoused populations? What can advocates and practitioners do? And just want to hear everybody's thoughts on this. If we could go around and have a quick, maybe 1 minute on this, and then we'll try to go to the questions. So maybe we'll start with Marcia, since you didn't answer the last question.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. The two ideas that come most immediately to mind are just that, the EJ movement, born in the early 1980s, is really hitting a point of maturation where, I think it has more breadth to expand out and consider these, questions that probably weren't at the heart of the movement, because the origin of the movement, had to do with noxious sources being cited in people's backyards. And if you don't, have a permanent building, you don't have a backyard. So it's heartening to, see this panel, to see and hear what everyone's sharing, and think about the different ways in which the resources, the coalitions, the deep connectivity within government that we have today in the US can expand to include consideration of people who are living without a permanent building. From the researcher standpoint, I'll just state the obvious that doing research with communities who are experiencing homelessness can be really difficult. And as a community engaged scholar, I'm very much committed to doing research with rather than research on people, and doing research with people requires long-term relationships. And again, that can be difficult when folks are moving around a lot. But again, I'm interested to see these various forms of research that are coming to the foreground. And I'm thinking specifically of legislative theater. And there's a group out of the UK called the Greater Manchester Homelessness Action Network that's using legislative theater as a way to include lots of different people in the understanding of the experience of homelessness. And then it creates policies and recommendations that then get brought to policymakers and decision makers. And so, yeah, I guess I'll just end there that community engaged research in this area can be challenging, but there are these interesting forms emerging, such as legislative theater, that might help us to be able to reach those goals.
Thank you. Let's hear from Senator Washington, if you don't mind.
Okay. Make sure I have my sound on. Great. Okay, great. Excellent. Thank you so much. And again, it's been wonderful to be here. Yes, we need to produce more literature on the issues. So organizations that are publishing the works of individuals who are doing this work need to be more involved, need to be funded, need to be promoted. Homelessness as an environmental justice issue needs to have a robust approach to giving voice to those who've been affected by it. So again, I agree very much with Dr. Hale. Justice, as we really know, it's not usually planned or granted or studied, right? It's demanded by those to sort of build off of a well-known quote, those who need to be heard. And so too often we sit in boardrooms and we have access to power and we can talk and plan. But however, as I see it, we don't really hear the voice of the population who's being affected by it in these forums. And so if we were to meet again, I would suggest that we have direct testimony that's written. We have in-person or some other media to better understand the issues so that we're not telling people what their problems are, but we listen to them, and then we'd be more likely to have better solutions and information about, where we should go. We certainly can have better understandings. So that's the biggest thing, is I think to make sure that we have affected populations in the rooms wherever we're having these conversations.
Thanks. Appreciate that. That's the community engagement is very key, and I hear that being echoed in what Marcia, Dr. Hale, you're saying. Joe, if you want to speak to this.
Sure, and the big point that I was going to emphasize has already been made by Dr. Hale and Senator Washington, including the voices of those with lived experience. And I use a term where I use inclusion, meaning if you're going to include the voices of those who are experiencing homelessness as environmental justice advocates, just don't get their voice to understand the problem. You go out, you do your qualitative surveying, you understand the problem, but now when you develop the policy recommendations and you go to Congress, you go, but not them. No, include them in the entire advocacy process, from understanding the problem to making the policy recommendations and the decisions, and then also that advocacy with Congress. Inclusive inclusion, that's what I call it.
Great, thank you. Go to Eric.
I will just add that, with climate change, our cities have to, totally re-envision and redo, not just our energy sources, but much of our infrastructure. And this is going to involve a huge planning process. And many cities are already developing climate plans, and some cities are including environmental justice principles in them and having them guide them. And one city, Providence, Rhode Island, is a great example, as a climate justice plan. And a main component that they feature in the plan is housing. and making sure that housing access is a big part of climate justice. And so this creates all kinds of opportunities for allyships, in order to actually make change in the way cities function.
Great, thank you. And we'll end with you, Lisa.
Great. One thing I've been honored to do is be part of a coalition that is working on the Willamette River Superfund project. And we've been able to be at the table when the state representatives, the county representatives, the city representatives, and all their lawyers are at this table, and we're trying to come up with a community benefit agreement that people that are unhoused in underserved communities that have been poisoned by the toxins in the river for years have a say in the cleanup. Who's going to get these jobs? How much of the cleanup is acceptable so that we can have future generations fish in the river, recreate around the river, have the water come into future housing that is not just affordable, but obtainable, future jobs. And by being able to be one of the representatives at this table, I have gone out and done the homework for hearing the voices of our houseless. And so when I come to the table and say, look, this is what we will accept. This is what needs to happen. We're, I think, probably one of the first cities, Portland, Oregon, in the nation to be able to have this type of inclusive environment. And we need more across the nation.
Great, thank you so much. What I'm hearing is meaningful, real meaningful community engaged work. That's really what we need to do. And obviously, there's a number of, going back to talking about the pandemic, that it's a huge challenge to do community engaged work. I feel like during this time, the need for a comprehensive planning, a holistic approach, this climate justice plan you're talking about, Eric, I think that really thinking about things holistically and bringing the right people to the table. Thank you so much for everybody for your sharing your insights and your expertise. It's such an honor to be here with you today. And I just want to now kind of pivot. We have about 10 minutes left. We're going to do a little Q&A. So I'm looking in the chat for some questions. The first question that comes up I see is, how can we speak about any sustainability and environmental justice without full solutions of problems for unhousing, homelessness, and other forms of social inequality? So I'm curious if anybody wants to answer this.
I think we've heard it several times throughout our discussion from each and every one of us, that phrase holistic approach. I mean, until we really address the broader social inequalities that we have within our society, all of these social issues that we're talking about really will remain as they are, because multiple systems impact a single, social issue. And so Shmuel, who asked that question, that is an excellent question. That is something that we talk about at the federal level all the time. And when I go into communities, and I'm particularly talking to homeless services providers or what's called the continuum of care, I often emphasize, listen, it can't just be you all at the table, but you have to bring folks from the other systems at the table, whether it's the justice system, the child welfare system, the education system, because this really requires a holistic approach to address multiple social inequities to really get at solving these issues.
Excellent, thank you so much. Great. Are there any other questions?
I could say that's what the federal government is doing right. And I also, Dr. Savage, I want to also say that the interagency approach, that just that whole model is absolutely, fundamental, and it has been, I think it was a paradigm shift when it was created. And so my comments are just about moving it forward. But we've implemented that at the state level, passing legislation to have our interagency council. It was just an advisory council, but now it actually changed it to have the actual agency heads and not simply their designees. And so that really does provide that sort of interdisciplinary approach. And so I guess the next field is the intersectionality with regard to in issues of identity, but also structural inequalities, to incorporate that into our models as well.
And Senator Washington, the state of Maryland has one of the most functional state interagency councils on homelessness in the nation. Just want to let you guys know that. Maryland, you guys are really rocking and rolling when it comes to that interagency collaboration.
Yeah, and it was the result, if I could say again, it was the result when we created our task force on ending unaccompanied homeless youth. We had as a part of that task force youth. We had as a part, and not just the agency heads, but individuals. And so they were a part of crafting that bill that created the Interagency Council, and then all of the other legislation, and they testify and come to the bill signings. And so for those of you who are just, I would like to say that it takes work to learn how to be humble and not missionary in our approach. In other words, to really not simply just bring people to the table and display them at the hearing or at the fundraiser, but to fully accept the decisions that they make, particularly when I was working with youth as an adult, having the humility and the respect to fully accept the approach that they want to take. That takes a lot of, it's not an easy thing to do. So it takes, but it's wholly worth it. The final project is so much better. We did a youth census. We did we actually did the first census of unaccompanied homeless youth in 6 jurisdictions. We've done our second one now, it's up to 10 jurisdictions, but I guess I'll wrap it up by saying absolutely engaging people and having them be a part of the process. It just makes everything better.
Great, thank you. And I would like to note that question was from Shmel. I'm sorry that I didn't say your name when we first asked the question, but now I do have another question here from Yvette that says, in areas that experience high chemical disasters and shelter-in-place events, how can we push the EPA for the unhoused to have an option to shelter in place and evacuate? Any thoughts here about, connecting with the EPA in any sort of way here about this, or perhaps any solutions that otherwise that you might see?
This might be unhelpful and just rather obvious, but I do just want to point out that the EPA has a listserv that folks can join, and they host many community, public meetings each month on different topics. So most likely that's speaking the obvious, but just in case anyone's interested who hasn't joined that listserv, and isn't participating in those conversations directly with the EPA, that could be an interesting option.
And I think it's important to join that listserv and get involved with the conversation, because if I'm understanding Yvette's question correctly, the thing that I would suggest really engaging the EPA around is being more proactive than responsive. So let's say there is a chemical disaster. Typically, EPA funding won't kick in until after the disaster happened for a lot of things. So to really shelter in place and evacuate and already have those resources when it happens, really communities would have to rely on other funding sources, for that. So really engaging in that conversation and start really pushing the ideology to be more proactive than responsive when it comes to the EPA and responding to disasters.
Excellent, thank you for that perspective there, I think we have time for perhaps one more question. So this question is from Stacy. What are the mental health advocacy connections being made in support of victims of homelessness and displacement?
Could you repeat that again?
Sure. What are the mental health advocacy connections being made in support of victims of homelessness and displacement?
So a lot of the advocacy work that I see on the ground as it relates to mental health and homelessness is really coming from not only the persons who are experiencing homelessness and are dealing with mental health issues, but also the provider community, those who are, providing those services, as well as local departments of behavioral health. And so where I've seen successful communities are those where they have a very strong Department of Public Health that is working in conjunction with their local services providers and are really pushing forth an advocacy agenda at the local, state, as well as federal level to really increase resources for those who are homeless and dealing with mental health issues.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I think we're going to end it here. Unless anybody has a little bit of follow-up. Did I see a hand?
Yes, I just wanted to add that there's a lot of work out there around trauma-informed care, and not just like a prerequisite for getting a job through one of the major social service agencies, but a lot of the grassroots, smaller organizations, advocacy organizations are doing trauma-informed care, so that when we are out talking with people, we have a more encompassed approach to talking with people one-on-one and learning about what their needs are. Sometimes their rant could just be someone who needs to vent, not trying to push anything on them, but trying to understand all the trauma that they're experiencing. So trauma-informed care is something that's definitely being pushed and definitely has positive outcomes.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate all of you here with us today. I'm very happy to have moderated this session and been able to learn from all of you, all your perspectives. And thanks to everybody who was here, who attended this session. And thanks for all of your thoughtful questions. So we're going to wrap things up. If you are interested, there's another round of concurrent sessions followed by the afternoon plenary sessions. So thank you all for being here, and enjoy the rest of the symposium. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great to meet you. I look forward to working with all of you. I'm going to call all of you for testimony and to
Keep writing great groundbreaking legislation, please.
We are foot soldiers.
We'll
got
keep doing it.
an army of foot soldiers here.
There we go. I got you. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody on the call.
All right, thank you.
Pleasure, everyone.